Okay, so this is my talk over of our slides for real business cycle theory. So I just made a little introduction where I talked about what a business cycle is and why we're interested in studying it. So a bit about macroeconomics history. So a lot of what sort of spurred on economists in the second half of the 20th century and since the 1930s was the experience of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was in the United States and also in other Western countries around the world. I mean, here's the important fact. GDP per capita fell around 30 to 50% from 1929 to 1933. So again, to reference what I said in the introduction, we have the same amount of labor, the same amount of capital, the same know-how, and yet somehow we got half as much cake in 1933 as we had in 1929. So that's kind of crazy. How can that happen? And then moreover, unemployment rose from around 3 to 5% in 1929 to 20 to 25%. So just to remind you what unemployment is, it's not everyone in society, it's only the people that are actively looking for jobs. So of every 5 people or 4 people looking for a job, 1 person couldn't find work in 1933. Which is really tough for families, especially back then when often only one family member was working. That was real suffering, right? There was much less produced, and then even among those that sort of had any income at all, I should say, either among those that wanted to work, only 75 to 80% of them actually could find work. So it was a very tough time. And the important thing, I guess, for economics is that there was this widespread belief that it was poor economic policy that either caused or at least prolonged the length of the Depression, poor monetary policy. That, and then also there's a widespread belief that it was a change in U.S. policy that got the U.S. out of the Depression. And, the Great Depression, its causes and how we got out of it has generated a ton of research, and there's a ton of differing opinions which I'm not going to get into here, but this was sort of this event that really shocked society, and it sort of left this lasting impression, especially on people that lived through it or had parents that lived through it. So it really dominated sort of the economics conversation and the topics that economists studied for 50 years later. So here's kind of a picture of the economy, and I drew something like this in the introduction as well, but if you look, this graph starts in 1870 and it goes till 2011, and what we're looking at is the natural log of GDP per capita. Okay, so when you look at this graph, you can think of this slope as the growth rate of GDP per capita, and what you see is really the growth rate of GDP per capita has been almost constant since 1870. It's basically chugging along at, I believe, around 2% a year. We can kind of look here. What is the actual slope of this line? And what you'll see is it goes up about half of a square every 10 years. Okay, so if you look here, 10 years is like here, that's 10 years. And here you'll see that in 10 years it goes up about half of a square, which means that the slope of this line is well, I guess it should be it should be 0.2, right? Because the growth rate is 0.02, so in 10 years it should be 0.2. And do we see that actually? Let's see here. So 0.2 would be like from here to here. Looks like it's growing a little faster. Yeah, actually now that I say that, I think that's right. I think I remember this line isn't, the slope of this line isn't 0.2, it's more like 0.3, implying that the growth rate of the economy on average was around 3% in the United States during this period. Okay, and then along that sort of constant growth path, you can see that there's these fluctuations. So there's ups and downs, there's booms and busts here in the 1880s. Apparently there's a boom. In the 1890s there was a bust, etc., etc. And then you see these two big humps. So this big one here is the Great Depression, and then this post-depression boom, well, that's actually World War II, where we see this big upsurge in the line. I think we should be careful with that, because during World War II, we didn't have a good way of measuring the value of the economy, because we didn't have a market, really. A lot of what was produced was sort of ordered by the military and the government, so it's a bit hard to value, what's the value of a bomber compared to a loaf of bread, right? It's hard to make that comparison. But in any case, forget World War II. This bump is somewhat of an aberration, so you want to be a little bit careful in this area interpreting this. But let's start here. After World War II, this is like the 1950s and 60s, and we have this prolonged sort of period of quicker growth per capita. Okay, so that brings us back to that trend line. Along the trend line through the 60s to basically now. And then this last little bump here is the Great Recession. And now now that it's after 2011, we can actually kind of continue this thing, and we actually see that this probably increased a little bit here, and is now closer to the trend line again. So I'll leave that there for our first short video.